All right. Welcome to episode 2 of this week's lecture. Let's now zoom out a bit and talk about the bigger academic picture. Well, since the global financial crisis in 2008, there has been a kind of academic revival, if you wish, around the word capitalism or capital. For decades before that, it was almost like the C word had gone out of fashion, especially in mainstream social sciences and public discourses. Instead of talking about capitalism as a system, people were more focused on things like policy tweaks, market failures, or institutional reforms. In social sciences, most of the time, at best, we were talking about neoliberalism, just as a version of capitalism. As if the root problems was just a few bad apples or the wrong party in power or a bad version or dysfunctional version of capitalism. But capitalism itself was taken for granted, just a background of modern life, most of the time as the elephant in the room, not being seen. But the 2008 crisis shook that up. It exposed some deep structural issues and forced people to start asking more fundamental questions about how the system actually works, who benefits, and what kind of future it's creating or destroying. And with that shift, all the old debates and divisions around how to define capitalism came roaring back. That's what this slide is about. We're now going to look at some of the major lines of controversy and confusion that have come back into focus over the last 15 years, especially among academics. So you can see here two big dividing lines. One is capitalism a thing, like a stock of money, machines, or property, or is it is it better understood as a social process or relation, power relation, something that exists through ongoing acts of investment, extraction, and control? And second, is capitalism just about production relations, like who owns the means of production and who sells their labor? Or is it a much broader social formation, something that shapes not just economic life, but also care work, education, politics, culture, and in the environment? These debates aren't just abstract, they shape how we diagnose the problems of today's world and what kind of alternatives we can even imagine. So it's not just the public that is kind of confused about what capitalism is it good or bad, but you can see, um, uh, although in different forms, other types of divisions and disagreements and confusion in the academia among the scholars. So let's walk through some of these in more detail. Well, all right, let's take a step back for a moment and look at where the word capital even comes from, because it's had a long and widening journey. So originally in the 13th century, capital literally meant the head, like the top of a column or a pillar. The thing that's at the top, holding everything up, right? And that's kind of interesting because even back then, the word already carried this sense of being important, main, dominant, on the top, as we see more clearly by the 15th century. Now, by the 1610s, as this information from the website, etymology website, or Etym Online, tells us by 1610s things started to shift. Capital becomes associated with a person's wealth, their stock or property. Then by the 1640s, it's used more directly in the context of business. That is the wealth used to run a business. So that's not the whole wealth that you accumulate. The top of the wealth that you actually don't consume it, and you reinvest it in your business. So it's the top of the wealth, the head of the wealth, lost capital. So then by 1793, the political economists start using the word in a more systemic way, that part of the produce of industry which is available for further production. So that sounds a bit abstract, but it basically means capital isn't just wealth. It's wealth doing work, making more wealth. It is the top part of the wealth that is not to be consumed. Then just before that, in 1791, we get the word capitalist, literally a man of money, someone with enough property or resources to run a business. It actually came from French revolutionaries, and it wasn't a compliment. It was a bit of a dig, a term of critique, if you may like to say. Okay, now here's where it gets a bit more politically charged. By 1872, the word capitalism starts being used explicitly to mean a system that supports or encourages capitalists. But it wasn't used in a natural or positive way. Again, it was originally a term of criticism, mostly by socialists. By 1877, we see the word used to describe the word was used to describe the concentration of capital in the hands of a few. So now the idea of capitalism is tied up with power, not just having wealth, but the influence that comes with it. And there's also this old quote from the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1929 that kind of captures the confusion we still have today. It says there is no satisfactory definition of the term capitalism, though nothing is more evident than the thing, which is great, right? Basically, we don't know exactly what is it, but we all know it's there. And what does the code say? It is, well, links capitalism to the system of producing and trading for profit, mainly through private ownership or private enterprise, where people seek to make a living by employing others for a wage. A point that was actually picked up in the conversation with the key cutter, if you may remember. He was aware of that component. So you can see how by now the word is loaded with assumptions about how society should be organized. Wealth creation, wage labor, and private ownership. So even just looking at the history of the word, you can already see how messy and contested it's become over time. All right, so let's start with one of the biggest debates out there. What even is capital? Now, if you ask someone trained in mainstream economics, they'll usually say capital is a thing, a resource, something that's used in production, like machinery, tools, buildings, or money. You might have heard the term factors of production. Capital is one of those alongside land and labor. And this goes all the way back to Adam Smith, who saw capital as as something measurable, almost a kind of a mechanical element in the economy, something producers and consumers use, guided by price signals to make the system work more efficiently. The idea is save capital, invest it wisely, and it helps grow the economy through innovation, productivity, better organization, that sort of thing. So in this view, capital is like an object you can own or accumulate, something quantifiable, a thing. And this framing is still very influential today. It's how most governments, businesses, schools, and media commentators tend to talk about capital as something neutral and productive as long as it is in the right hands. But as we'll see in the next slide, that's only one way of thinking about it. There is a very different interpretation that flips this view on its head. Let's take a look. Okay, now let's take a look at the other side of the debate. The idea that capital is not just a thing, but a social relation, a process, something that unfolds between people and groups. This is where Marx and many critical political economists come in. So instead of thinking of capital as say a pile of money or a machine, this view says no, capital is really about power. Who controls the means of production, like equipments, machineries, buildings, etc., etc.? Who owns what? Who gets to make decisions and who gets exploited in the process? It's a relationship between classes, between those who own capital and those who have to sell their labor power for a wage to survive. And this isn't static, it moves. Capital flows through a cycle. You might have seen the formula before, MC M prime. Let me break that down in case you haven't seen it before. Well, M stands for money. A capitalist starts with some money, right? I mean, a good amount of money, really. They use that money to buy C, which stands for commodities. And this initially includes, what do we mean by commodities? This initially includes raw materials, machinery, and crucially, labor power. Yes, labor power is also part of the commodities, initial commodities that the capitalist buys. Which means that by labor power, I mean the ability of workers to work, but also the end products considered as commodity. Then through production, those inputs are turned into new commodities, products or services like chairs, shoes, computers, cell phones, whatever. It could also be services, not just necessarily goods. So these are then sold for M prime in the market, which is more money than the capitalists started with. If M prime is not bigger than M, if the money that they make is not bigger than the money they invest, they will be out of the business. They will be eliminated. So it should always, M prime should always be bigger than M. So the goal isn't just to, so in this process, as you could see, the goal isn't just to break even, it's to end up with a profit. So the whole point of this cycle is not to satisfy needs or produce useful things, to exchange it in the market for something that you couldn't produce. It's the purpose, the primary purpose is to accumulate capital, more capital. It's money in, more money out. That's the engine of capitalism. Now, what I've argued, building on Marx and others, is that capitalism isn't just economic. We can still talk about capital as an object or thing, like the money that is paid to buy the labor power and machinery. Even we may consider labor power and machinery as part of capital, uh, the thing, but it's also deeply socio-political. It's also processual, processual, meaning it's always in motion. The value of it moves from the initial investments into the raw materials and equipment and the labor power bought and brought into production. Then it moves into or takes the form or shape of the new products or commodities or services, if you like, which can be then which can be the form of goods or services. Then when the products or services are sold in the market, it finds the new shape of money again, and then a portion of it finds its way back to the production or service provision again in the form of investment and wages, and that cycle repeats itself over and over again. As you know, assuming that every time the cycle comes up with more money. So you see, capital is kind of value that is in constant motion with its own speed, that constantly tunes the rhythm of our social and ecological life to its own pace. So under capital, when we talk about value, we normally think of price, but price is only a market manifestation or expression of value rather than the value itself. Okay, as an example, wage the wages are known as the price of labor. They don't, or the wage does not measure the value of labor actually, because as we will see later, it's impossible for capitalism to return the entire value that the labor produces or puts into production in the form of wage, and make profit at the same time. So capital works by organizing ownership and control in a way that gives the capitalist class the upper hand. That upper hand lets them extract more value from workers' labor power than they pay back in wages. That's how profit is made. So if we think of capital as a process of domination, not just a thing you can own or save, it totally shifts how we understand the world and who holds power in it. So let's keep going and look at how this plays out in different types of systems. All right. Um, let's now take a closer look at how different kinds of economic systems, especially here we're going to make a comparison between non-capitalist system and a capitalist system. So we would know if we live under a capitalist system today or we are living under a non-capitalist system or maybe a mixture of both. So um, well, this, as you can see this in this slide, helps us better understand what makes capitalism distinct. So we've got three different models here, and they are kind of like different recipes for how value gets created and moved around. So let's just start at the top. This is a non-capitalist mode of commodity production or service provision. So again, as you can see, this starts with C, unlike the capitalist system. It starts with C, then M, and then C prime. So this one is non-capitalist commodity production. Here people already own the means of production like land, tools, workshops, privately or collectively, and they are producing things to meet needs, not to grow capital. Say a craftsperson makes shoes in the local market and sells them to buy food. So that's C, shoes, M for money, and C prime would be the food they couldn't produce themselves. So the point here is money is just a medium. That's all. And as you can see, in non-capitalist societies like the one before the rise of capitalism and the ones that still exist around the corners, both money and market did and do exist. So market and money should not be equated with capital or capitalism. Because they existed for many, many centuries or millennia. So the goal isn't to make a profit. That's what make capitalism different. It's to exchange what you've produced for something you need. So that's not the goal under capitalism. So the non-capitalist system might exist in traditional societies or among a small producer. Still, it might exist. And importantly, economic power is shaped by political and social norms under a non-capitalist system, like kinship rules or community customs, like in the indigenous case, not the other way around. Now, number two, or the second system, is what we discussed in the previous slide, which is MCM prime, or if we can expand it, would be MC, including labor power, P for production, C prime, new products or produces, and then being sold in the market for more money, M prime. So this is the classic capitalist circuit. Here is what's different to a non-capitalist. So capitalists start with money, as we said, use that to buy commodities, including labor power, and turn those into products through production. That's the P. Then they sell the products for more money, M prime, which is profit, which is being privately confiscated or owned by the private owners and controllers of the whole process. So the goal here isn't to meet a need, it's to grow capital that belongs to the private owners, not the workers or real producers. So the workers don't own the tools or factories or the means of service provision. They only have their ability to work, which they sell for a wage. That's what we mean by commodification of labor. That is treating our time and energy like any other input in a machine or a machinery of production. And economic power becomes the driving force. It shapes politics, laws, media, and everything else around it. There is also another system, if you like, or circuit, which is M going to M prime, bypassing commodity production. Guess what that could be? Well, uh, it's a pure finance model, right? There is no production at all. This is the world of stocks, bonds, forex, and derivatives. Money chasing money, just trying to multiply itself. Yes, as crazy as this. So you put in money, and through a speculation, loans, rent, or financial tricks, you get more money out. But apparently, no goods are made. I said apparently. No labor is apparently or directly involved. This is the realm where financial capital dominates. Again, apparently decoupled from the real economy. Well, this one is not post-capitalist, unlike some people may want us to believe. It's just another kind of capitalism, and it's been around from the beginning of the history of capitalism or even earlier, but it's been getting stronger and stronger over the past few decades. And this is finance-led capitalism or finance capital or finance capitalism, where money is used to make more money without going through the production process. And there is no factory, no labor, no commodity apparently, just a speculation, trading, leveraging in the stock market and real estate, hedge funds, crypto, you name it. Um, okay, think of it as money jumping straight to more money, M prime. And here is the twist. This kind of capital doesn't replace the older industrial model. I agree with Jim Stanford in his book, and the rest of Marxists like him, that at the end of the day, people can't eat money or stocks or bonds. They still need real food, real goods and services that someone must produce. Yes, production is still central and vital. The fact that most of it's offshored to the poorer countries does not mean it does no longer exist. The industrial capital, I mean. We need our production. So we need to bear in mind that in today's capitalism, big finance set the terms for industrial capital now. It pushes companies to cut costs, automate jobs, offshore production to places where cheap labor and cheap nature exists, usually in the global south. So while M prime seems abstract, it still depends on real value extraction from people's labor and the environment. These are still the ultimate sources of value, even if they are hidden behind layers of financial complexity. That's how M prime, or finance capital, still relies on M prime circuit underneath it. But also it often dominates and restructures it. So finance-led capitalism also fuels instability. We get booms and busts, crises, bubbles, and bubbles burst, and growing precarity. It speeds up everything. That's part of what drives the gig economy, where capital no longer wants long-term workers or commitments, just fast, flexible, low-risk ways to squeeze out profit. So to wrap this up, all three circuits, as you can see in this slide, uh, you know, mm, they're not equal. Capitalism is not one fixed model. It mutates. And finance capital may look like a casino gambling with money to make more money, but it's still deeply tied to exploitation and to crises we face today. All right, let's bring this debate between capital as a thing versus capital as a process into the 21st century academic debates with a name many of you may have heard, Thomas Piketty or Thomas Piketty. So Piketty made global headlines with his book Capital in the 21st Century. In that book, he tries to revive the idea of capital as something worth studying deeply again. But in doing so, he also reintroduces some older assumptions. Piketty's big discovery, based on hundreds of years of historical data, was that wealth inequality is getting worse, not better. He showed that when the rate of return on capital is higher than the rate of economic growth, the rich, those who already own capital, get richer simply by owning things, not by working, not by putting their money into work. So meanwhile, wages grow much more slowly, if they grow at all, the real wages. And this leads to growing inequality over time, um, unless something interrupts it. So what does he propose? Mainly a global wealth tax. In other words, tax the rich more heavily, especially on their accumulated assets like property, investment, and inheritance, especially. For Piketty, the goal is to reduce inequality without getting rid of capitalism, just regulating it better. What does he mean by capital then? Well, for him, it's pretty much a stock of assets. Anything that can be owned, held, and traded. And that includes land, real estate, shares, intellectual property, even art or jewelry collections. Uh, Whether or not it's actively used doesn't really matter. If it can be traded and produce wealth down the line, from his point of view, is capital. Now, that's a classic capital as a thing view, right? Now, capital here is treated as an object, something you can measure, hold, and assign a value to. But not everyone is really happy with that. People like David Harvey, who is a very famous geographer and also political economist and Marxist, for example, argue this totally, Piketty's view or definition of capital totally misses the point. Yeah, he flips the script and says, capital, David Harvey says, capital is not a thing, it's a process. And it's not just what you own, it's about what that ownership allows you to do. So how money flows, how it gets reinvested, how it shapes labor relations and reinforces inequality. So it's about motion, circulation, and power. So in fact, David Harvey, criticizes Piketty for focusing too much on wealth inequality, as if the problem were just about some people having too many assets and then those assets are not productive, rather than looking at how capital actually works to create those inequalities in the first place. So for David Harvey, what matters is the dynamic, not just the data. And this whole debate between them, well, it echoes the same old divide we saw earlier. Is capitalism just stuff you can count and track, or is it a social process that transforms relationship, work, and even ecosystems? So the issue is that Piketty treats capital mostly as an object, something to redistribute, rather than a process or power relation that shapes how society functions. He focuses on the outcome of inequality, not the system that keeps producing it. That's why critics like David Harvey argue that just taxing wealth doesn't change how capital exploits labor or nature, or how it restructures society to serve accumulation in the first place. So even though Piketty gives us valuable data and a strong case against inequality, his solution remains stuck with the system, not aimed at transforming it. His framework doesn't really help us imagine alternatives to capitalism, only a more equal version of it. And this brings us back to that deeper tension in the study of capitalism that we've been exploring. Capital as a thing versus capital as relation or process. And we'll keep seeing this pop up even in today's most popular economic debates, as we just discussed, between people like Thomas Piketty or Thomas Piketty and people like David Harvey. All right, let's kick off with one of the biggest feel-good stories we hear about capitalism. Again, this is a myth, as we will see, and we would like to debunk it. That is basically just, capitalism is just basically free markets, small businesses and people competing on a level playing field. So you've probably heard this idea 100 times. If the government just stayed out of the way, the best ideas would win and everyone would have a fair shot. But let's be real, this version of capitalism is more of a myth than a reality. Well, uh, there is this belief, sometimes called capitalist realism, that any alternative or even a slight deviation from this ideal is just unthinkable. Life, if you bring up if you bring up regulation or public ownership, you're immediately told that's not capitalism anymore. Now, here comes the first of five reasons why this is a problem, is why this is a myth. History simply doesn't back it up. That's the first reason. Um, Capitalism didn't evolve from peaceful competition between small businesses. It was built on what Marx called primitive accumulation. That means things like colonization, land grabs, slavery, and the violent disposition of people's commons or common land. That's how capital was first concentrated. It wasn't earned in fair race, it was taken by force. And once the system got going, it didn't level the playing field, it entrenched inequality. The winners didn't just win once, they kept on winning. And we're born into a world where wealth and power are already stacked, and most of us are playing catch up or stuck at the bottom. So, well, meanwhile, many countries in the global south are still being mined for cheap labor and cheap nature to keep this system going. So no, capitalism wasn't born in some friendly small business marketplace, I'm afraid to say. So that's just the beginning of the story we're told, not the one history actually, not something that history can actually show. So let's now keep going, and we've got four more big reasons coming up on the next two slides. Okay, let's look at in this slide. Let's look at the two more big reasons why the rosy picture of capitalism as just healthy competition between free individuals doesn't really hold up. Okay, the second reason or counter argument is that the people who make the value aren't the ones who own what they make. So in capitalism, there is a deep structural divide. Workers, the real value makers, don't own the tools, machines, factories, or land they need to create things. Those are owned privately by someone else, well, the capitalists. And this means value creation is already an unequal relationship in the first place. So the folks who own the capital, what we might call the value takers, are the ones with the power. So even though workers do the actual work, they don't have much say in what happens to the value they produce. Ownership gives the upper hand, and workers are structurally locked out of the benefits. Well, number three, or the third reason as a counter argument to the idea of capitalism being, free enterprise and healthy competition, is that capitalism always requires profit, and profit requires taking more than you give. Here's the hard truth about how capitalism works. If a business doesn't make a profit, well, it won't survive. But to make a profit, it can't just give all the value back to the workers or real producers. That means the people who make the value, whether they're building something, teaching, coding, farming, have to be paid less than the value they generate. And that leftover value, we call it, or Marx called it, surplus value. That surplus gets taken by the capitalist and turns into what is known as profit. So there's a built-in logic here, right? To keep the system going, workers have to be consistently undercompensated or underpaid in relation to the actual value they produce. And this isn't a bug in the system, it's the feature of the system. That's why inequality doesn't go away in a capitalist economy. Even if you have lots of small businesses or competition, because profit depends on it. Before I continue, I have two footnotes to share with you before we go to the fourth and fifth counter arguments against the myth. And here is my first footnote. Here I want to clarify what we mean by value, because we use the word value a lot of times. We have used it so far. So when we say value here, we're talking about value as defined under capitalism. That is something measurable in market terms, exchangeable for money, and generally aimed at generating profit. It's a very narrow definition, right? It's a value of commodities, value of labor, and normally it's manifested, as we said before, in the form of prices. So it leaves out all kinds of things we might care deeply about, like community well-being, caring relationships, or the health of ecosystem that don't necessarily make money, but are still incredibly valuable to a good life. So since we are analyzing capitalism, we are talking about capitalist value, not the intrinsic value of things. Their value from the community point of view, or those sort of things, or from the life point of view, planetary life point of view. So we're using the capitalist definition of value here on purpose, not because we agree with it, but to show that even if you accept the system's own logic, way of valuing things, serious contradictions appear. And later in the course, and the other course I teach, SOCA 3780, leading social change, we'll explore how we can challenge this whole framing from outside capitalism, and redefine value on different, more life affirming terms. And my second footnote is related to wages and the entitlement to profit. It might look like workers get a fair deal, a job contract that says you're paid for 8 hours of work a day. But this is a nominal exchange, not a real equivalence. Under capitalism, it's structurally impossible for workers to receive back the full value they create, because if they did, there'd be nothing left as profit for the capitalist. That's the whole logic of surplus value. Workers produce more than what they're paid, and that extra gets captured by the owner of the production process. Now, you might say, well, what if we automate everything? Wouldn't that eliminate the role of labor as the only factor that adds value to things? But hold on. Let's say a desk factory becomes fully automated, okay? Sure, that one factory may no longer need workers, but across the entire economy, it doesn't work like that. As automation in one sector pushes people out of jobs, it swells the pool of available labor elsewhere. So that drives wages down, and makes human labor cheaper overall. And here is the twist. In many industries like mining, logging, caregiving, or food processing, if especially they are located in the periphery, in the regional areas, or in the third world countries, capitalists start thinking, right? Why invest in expensive machines when there is an oversupply of cheap labor? And so automation doesn't eliminate the need for labor across the system. It often just relocates or reshuffles it. So in the end, it's still labor, human labor. That is the only force capable of creating new value by transforming raw materials into something socially useful and exchangeable. Even the machines used to automate production had to be built by someone, right? Somewhere first. So, how does the capitalist justify taking the profit and owning the product? Well, it all comes down to the ownership of production process, including your labor. I mean, legally, the capitalists own the workplace, the equipment, the raw materials, and 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 labor once you sign the contract. So you're not treated as a partner in production with equal say. You're seen as cost alongside machinery, electricity, and rent. And this system strips workers of the right to control what they help produce or how profits are shared. So and this I mean treats human labor, even nature, as resources to be used. Hence the common terms like human resources or natural resources. And this logic isn't just found in private companies, unfortunately, it's everywhere, even in the public sector and even in universities. Many places, non-private, or public, have become corporatized, meaning they have adopted the capitalist logic. Staff are often treated as just another input to be managed and budged, and whenever they hit financial problems, or they argue that they have financial problems, the first thing to go is of course the jobs, the staff. um, so the staff are not seen as co-creators of value, even capitalist value, with a say in how things are run, or what purpose they serve. Now, let's wrap up this myth busting journey with the last 2 points. Okay, point number 4, to debunk that myth: markets are inevitably imperfect. The free market is often painted as this magical system where everything works out. Prices self-correct, competition keeps things fair, and everyone has a shot. But in reality, markets are full of flaws. One big issue is that labor can't really compete with capital. Think about it. If you are a worker, you can't wait years for returns the way investors can. So you need your income now. So you're much more dependent. So that's why capital always has the upper hand, unless it's regulated by the government or democratized, say owned by workers or communities. And there are also problems like information asymmetry, where some actors know a lot more than others, like big corporations versus small producers or consumers. Plus, you've got market failures, where important needs just don't get met because they are not profitable. So the idea that markets always self-correct and serve the common good, that just doesn't hold up. And argument number or counter argument number 5 is about social and ecological externalities that are being ignored under capitalism. Here's a big one that often gets brushed aside. Capitalism is great at producing things, but terrible at cleaning up after itself. So the market doesn't factor in things like, the pollution caused by production, the exhaustion of natural resources, the burnout and the stress of workers, the collapse of ecosystems. These are called externalities, basically side effects of economic activity that aren't paid for by the business that causes them. Collateral damages, like that term, that concept in modern wars. But someone has to pay eventually, right? So who picks up the tab? Usually not the company. Instead, it's society at large. Civil service sector or governments, if you like, communities, future generations, non-human life, they would end up carrying the burden. And that's why we can't just leave it to the market, because the market doesn't care about long-term sustainability or justice. It cares about profit. And anything outside that logic is, well, someone else's problem. Okay, let's now look at one of the more mainstream or textbook definitions of capitalism from Oxford Dictionary of Economics. Remember, this is a dictionary of economics, not sociology or social sciences. Notice here, we're moving away from the mythical view of capitalism as a purely free market utopia. Well, this distinction, or this definition acknowledges that capitalism does, in practice, operate with a mixture of public and private ownership. That distinction between public and private ownership, and that the government may regulate private activities to protect things like public health, safety, competition, or healthier competition, and the environment. So this is actually closer to what was practiced in many countries during mid 20th century, practically in places like Scandinavia or even in Australia post World War II. And these were times when the state actively intervened to restrain capital's destructive tendencies, to redistribute wealth, with better or more progressive taxation, build public infrastructures, and secure certain social rights, like the rights to housing, rights to free education, public education, etc., etc. But here is the catch. This doesn't mean that capitalism as a system fundamentally changes under this kind of regulations. It just means that during some historical moments, it had to be reined in to keep itself from collapsing. And importantly, even this kind of a state-regulated capitalism still maintained private ownership over the means of production and operated on the logic of, guess what, profit. Well, I just, yeah, it would just wear a civilized mask for a while. Now, if we look at this second definition from the Oxford Dictionary of Sociology, we see that even this more moderate state-regulated version of capitalism still revolve around the same core principles, as we said before. It's a system driven by wage labor, as this the definition in the Dictionary of Sociology says, by wage labor and commodity production for sale, exchange, and most crucially, profit. Not primarily for meeting the needs of the producers or communities, but for generating returns on investment. And what really jumps out here is that capitalism is described as not only dominant, but also largely unregulated and expanding across political and cultural frontiers. And that's quite an admission, right? It tells us that despite the ideal of checks and balances between public and private, the actual trend has been of deregulation, expanding corporate power, historically speaking, and erosion of public accountability. And we're now at a point where capital is so globally mobile and powerful that it bends political institutions to its will. Regulatory efforts, environmental protections, worker rights, antitrust policies are often dismantled or watered down. In fact, today we see democratic societies turning a blind eye to or even actively supporting authoritarian crackdowns on dissent. Images that we used to associate with authoritarian regimes in the global south are now coming from Western democracies. Police violence against peaceful protesters, censorship of anti-war and pro-Palestine voices, attacks on climate activists and extinction rebellion, etc., etc. So you say, yeah, we may not have the pure free market fantasy in practice, but what we do have is a version of capitalism that constantly works to remove its own restraints. And that means our political systems are increasingly complicit in injustices and violence at home and globally. Okay, all right, folks. That's a wrap for episode two. So far, we've unpacked what capital really is, not just a thing like money or machines, but also a powerful social process that shapes how we live, work, relate to each other, and even how we see value. And it's not just about buying and selling stuff in some perfect marketplace. It's about who owns, who controls, and who decides what matters. And we also busted some major myths like the idea that capitalism is naturally fair, competitive, or self-regulating. History tells us otherwise. As we said, it's a story full of dispossession, unfair value extraction, and massive cost to people and the planet. Even when governments try to rein in, capitalism tends to push back, and it often succeeds. Well, in the next episode, we're going to dig deeper by looking at two important thinkers, Jim Stanford and Nancy Fraser, who both understand capital as a dynamic process tied to power, not just markets. But they each approach it from different angles. And here's another a line of controversy. Stanford zooms in on labor and production, but Nancy Fraser expands the frame to include things like care work, nature, and racialized expropriation. So take a breath and let this all settle in, and I'll catch you in episode number 3. Thank you for your patience, and see you soon.